Welcome to all of you who are joining us today. I'm Bev Neufeld, president and founder of PowHer New York. We're a network of over 100 gender and racial justice organizations. We work in collaboration to create economic equity in New York. PowHer started as an equal pay campaign, and for over a decade, we have helped institute various new policies in New York to close the wage gap and the opportunity gap here. It would be impossible to thank all the advocates and legislative champions who actually move that work forward. But here in New York, we've been able to advance equal pay for substantially similar work, protections for workers who talk about their salaries, expanding the groups of marginalized people who are covered actually by the equal pay laws, and a ban on asking salary history, passed first in New York City and then in New York State. And of course, the reason we're here today, the Salary Transparency Law, which was passed in New York City in 2021 and amended in 2022. Also is passed in New York State in 2022. It's awaiting a signature from the governor. No law or policy has really received as much attention as Local Law 32, the Salary Transparency Law. It's a really simple law in that it requires that almost all job postings include maximum and minimum salary ranges. And it takes away, that's for New York City, it takes away the secrecy around wage setting. Frankly, it's a game changer. We have to thank Councilmember Helen Rosenthal, who pushed the passage of that bill in 2021, and then Councilmember Natasha Williams, who forwarded a new version in 2022. And she had business workers and advocates weigh in on this law and frankly argue the merits of it. Just like the New York State version, the current law we will talk about today is a result of debate, negotiation, and compromise. For many of us, this is real cause for celebration, especially for job seekers, employees, and the advocates who've been working for this, of course. But it has been a source of concern for businesses. Many folks think this is long overdue and the law is incomplete. And others feel it's been rushed and way too broad, even though the effective date was pushed back from May to today, November 1st. So there's much to discuss here and there's much at stake. And this session aims to share the details of the law, dig into the business and workers' implications, and then also look forward to what's next in the fight for gender and racial economic equity. We have an amazing panel to break down the law and its ramifications, and we'll get started right away. Each bio will be in the chat as people speak, so you can find out about our speakers. There's a question and answer function. We ask you to use that for your questions. When you do, please include your name and organization, and if you are pressed, please let us know. The session will be available online afterwards, and as well as the materials. And there is closed captioning for those of you who want to put that on. If you need help, please email info@powherny.org during the event or even after, and we'll try to answer any questions. So let's get started. We are going to start with JoAnn Kamuf Ward. She's Deputy Commissioner for Policy and External Affairs for the New York City Commission on Human Rights. That's the bureau that will be responsible for administering this law. So, JoAnn, the New York City Salary Transparency Law is part of the human rights law. So what we'd like you to do is to tell us about the human rights law and about this law in particular. So I turn it to you for that information, JoAnn. And thank you for all your work on this.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Bev, and really thanks to my co-panelists from Legal Momentum and the Commission on Gender Equity, Syndio, and all of you who are joining us today, as well as really, I think, the many, many people who have been fighting for equity before us, and will continue this fight after us. I'm honored to be here to speak about the human rights law. And as Bev mentioned, this is where the pay transparency protections sit in the city human rights law. So a few disclaimers before I start. I'm going to talk about the law, but any of the views and opinions that I share are my own and do not constitute legal advice. I will also flag for folks, I'm not part of the law enforcement bureau at our agency that will be enforcing the law, so I won't be involved in the complaint process, but I will talk a little bit about that process here today with all of you. So I hope many of you have heard of the New York City Human Rights Law. It is the city's anti-discrimination law that prohibits discrimination, harassment, and retaliation in employment, housing, and public accommodations. So in the employment context, where I'll be focusing today, the human rights law protects job applicants and employees from being treated differently on the basis of a protected category. Protected categories include race and gender and disability, age, sexual orientation and gender identity, pregnancy and criminal history, national origin, among others. And the law applies to hiring, it applies to terms and conditions of employment, treatment in the workplace, and termination as well. And I should note, for this audience, treatment in the workplace includes requiring that employers provide reasonable accommodations to their employees and prevent harassment and retaliation and take action when those do occur. So just for a little bit of context around the coverage of the human rights law generally applies to employers with 4 or more employees and employers of domestic workers, regardless of the numbers of employees that said individuals have. So the human rights law also protects interns, part-time and full-time employees, and independent contractors. So it's really quite robust. And to comply with the human rights law, employers have to do a few things. They have to have inclusive and non-discriminatory hiring and workplace practices, and they have to educate employees about their rights, posting notices of rights and offering certain trainings to employees. And lastly, employers need to have policies and practices that aim to eliminate discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. So prior to today, the human rights law had several provisions that were focused specifically on the ways that potential employers could comply with the law in relation specifically to job applicants. So these are protections intended to prohibit discrimination in hiring. This includes Fair Chance Act protections, which prohibit employers from asking about criminal history or taking adverse action based on criminal history, as well as a prohibition on asking about credit history in the employment context. I work at the Human Rights Commission, and I believe, like many others, that the human rights law is very strong. And I think we're all aware that laws that prohibit intentional discrimination have been on the books for decades. But workplace inequity, which includes job segregation and wage disparities, continue to manifest across the country, including in our own city, in New York City. So recognizing that more was needed to tackle pay inequity, the City Council amended the human rights law in 2017 to prohibit employers from asking job applicants about their salary history, something that Bev referred to in her opening remarks. And since that time, and really more recently over the past year or two, an array of states have adopted legislation to further address wage disparities and foster transparency in hiring, which can be one of the more opaque pieces of the workplace. And so, as Bev noted, we're gathered here today to talk about New York City's Pay Transparency Law, which is part of this nationwide, and I think I should even say global trend towards pay transparency. So the new provision of the human rights law requires covered employers, so those with 4 or more employees or individuals who employ a domestic worker, who are advertising jobs that can or will be performed in New York City, to display what they believe they're able to pay when they post or advertise a job. So breaking this down a little bit, an employer and an employment agency, which is also covered under our law, will be covered if they're advertising or posting a job, promotion, or transfer opportunity in writing and sharing it with a pool of applicants. So examples of this might be internet ads, it could be postings on internal job boards, communication blasts of all sorts, emails to staff, flyers that are distributed at job fairs, among many other modes of communication. And what the law itself requires is that employers include the minimum and maximum salary, annual, or the hourly wage. So that means the hourly or annual base rate of pay for a position. The range must represent amounts the employer in good faith believes they're able to pay someone for a position at the time that they're posting or advertising the job. And good faith is what an employer honestly believes they will be offering candidates for a posted position. Under the terms and the provisions of the human rights law, the pay range can only include the base wage or salary and not other forms of compensation and benefits. Of course, employers are always able to include additional information in a job posting on compensation or benefits packages, but that is not what the text of the New York City Human Rights Law requires. So at bottom, really, employers have to display what they think they're able to pay when they're advertising a job. So lastly, before I turn it over to a really excellent group of panelists, I just wanted to flag a few of the FAQs that we've been getting, frequently asked questions, as people are preparing for the effective date of the law. So I'll mention 3 questions. One is, how will this work with remote jobs? A second is, what is covered by salary? And a third is, will emails sent to my staff or internal postings be covered? So how does this law work with jobs that may be performed really across the country, right? So employers might post a position. And as we have articulated in a number of the commission materials on the law, if you are advertising for a position that can or will be performed, even in part in New York City, and that means from an office in the field or remotely, that would be covered by the law. What is covered by salary is the base annual salary or hourly wage, the rate of pay. And what mediums are covered? It is any writings that are circulated to a pool of potential applicants. I am going to stop speaking here. I'm really excited to turn it back over to Bev.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that information, for JoAnn. There is a link in the chat of the wonderful fact sheet that has been produced by the New York City Commission on Human Rights. So you can find that in the chat, and it goes over many of the details that you just talked about. So we're going to move on here. JoAnn, you mentioned that other cities and states are following in this law. And actually, among them are Colorado, Connecticut, and Nevada. They started mandating salary ranges on job postings last year. And similarly, California, Rhode Island, and Washington State go into effect in 2023, which is very exciting. I think what people may not know is that this law is already in effect in New York State, actually in Ithaca. It went into effect on September 1st. It's very much a copy of the New York City law. And Westchester County's version of this goes into effect on November 6th. So this is definitely a trend. And we have Christine Hendrickson with us to talk about the business side and the business reaction. So let's get Christine there. And then, do we see Christine?
Yes. Hi, Bev.
Okay, terrific, great. I think I'm going to bring everybody on at once, just so that we can have this can turn into a robust conversation. So I'm also going to introduce Seher Khawaja, who's one of the advocates behind this law, and she's the senior attorney at Legal Momentum. So we should have Seher join us. And then we'll include Jackie Ebanks, who's the head of the Commission on Gender Equity for New York City. And it's great to have her here as well. So they're going to pop
Thank
on
you.
as well.
We're on, Bev.
Okay, terrific. Now I can see you. Wonderful. So Christine, I'd like to start with you because this has really, been very interesting for businesses to have to post salary ranges. So can you talk about the business response, not necessarily in New York City, but in your experience working with large companies, what's their response been to the law? Maybe what are the pushbacks and how do you see this working as a positive for business?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that these pay transparency laws are no doubt having a huge impact, not only in the jurisdictions, or now 7 jurisdictions that currently do, like New York City and Colorado, or soon will require that employers post that information on pay ranges, and then also the ones that require the proactive disclosure at some point in the hiring process, like Nevada and Connecticut and Rhode Island. What we're seeing at the front lines at Syndio, and Syndio is an organization that works with large and leading employers to conduct pay equity analyses, to analyze their opportunity equity. What we're really seeing is that there's been a real shift to employers kind of initially maybe more resistant to sharing this information, to a lot of them really embracing it. Not all, but many are really embracing it because they're seeing that it is a way to build trust and credibility with their employees. And we're finding that the employers that are prioritizing this are reaping the rewards of that. So we just recently did an event with ZipRecruiter, and ZipRecruiter reported that jobs that included the pay range received 40% more views than jobs that didn't have the pay range. And in fact, the second most viewed thing in a pay range was the top end of the salary range, right after the job title. The things that people were looking at second was the top end of that pay range. And so for employers that have already adopted a nationwide approach to posting ranges, like Amazon and American Express and Zillow and Microsoft really leading the charge there, we think that it's really going to become the new norm. I think that if we look out, like if we were all looking out what the world looks like 2 years from now, I think that jobs without pay ranges are going to be much more the exception rather than the rule. It will be like if we went to the grocery store and there wasn't information about pricing on apples. It would just seem very odd to us. And I think that that's going to be the way that we're thinking about pay. And it's an uncomfortable conversation. So I understand that it's different than apples, but maybe it's not that different than the price of your house. None of us would have 5-10 years ago expected that we would be as comfortable as we are with places like Zillow posting where everyone can look up the pay, what you paid for your house if they have your address. And I think that that's the way that pay is going to go. And I think that that's reflected in what we're seeing out there in the market. One of our partners, Willis Towers Watson, did a recent survey, and they found that 79% of employers were planning on posting pay ranges, not just in the jurisdictions like New York City where it's required, but across the board, across the US. Sometimes, as JoAnn mentioned, looking at it from a more global perspective. So I think that we're just at the beginning of what's going to be a big shift. And Bev, you asked me, like, what are employers feeling? I don't want to sugarcoat it. It is a heavy lift for employers. At our company at Syndio, we recently did a workplace trends report. And we found that only 35% of respondents were fully ready to post their pay ranges. And it's not just from a compliance perspective, it's the operationalizing of it. It's deceptively simple. Posting pay ranges is deceptively simple. It seems easy, but it's actually hard because you really have to understand not just what the range is for the role, but they have to be empowered to have the conversation with every single applicant and every single employee who's looking up for the first time, potentially today, on their website for their company and finding out what the full range is for the role. They're going to have the conversation with everyone, which is, what is the range? Where do I fit within that range? And how do I get higher in that range? And that conversation is going to be echoing in New York City, across all of the employers in New York City, and across the US, as employers are increasingly taking an approach of, just because we have California and Washington State and New York City and all of these big jurisdictions requiring it, that they're moving towards making that available. So I would say that, on behalf of the business community, I would say that we should go into this with some grace, and understanding that it seems easy, but it's really complex, and it's going to take a minute for employers to really be able to have those conversations, and they want to have those conversations, because it's really important to the employers that I've been speaking with, that they are able to have those conversations with employees and be able to say, this is exactly where you are, and this is why. And I'll tell you a really quick funny story, which is my 78-year-old my father-in-law, who's 78, is still working. And he told me, he came to visit this weekend, and he told me, my compa ratio is 37%. And he is no HR expert, but these conversations are really happening, that everyone is becoming an expert in their own pay, and they're wanting to know, and they're looking to employers to be able to tell them, this is what your pay is, it's fair, this is how you are, where you are within the range, and this is how you get to a bigger a new spot. So as employers are doing this, kind of finding that Goldilocks-esque sweet spot of a range that's not too big and not too small and not too high and not too low, that we're all continuing to have those conversations. But I think that as we are looking out, there are huge upsides to employers, because I think that having these conversations will build some trust, that these are the ranges, this is what you do, this is what career pathing looks like. And it also allows people to look at other jobs and figure out what those ranges are as well.
Right. That's a very interesting point, that people can now look at other jobs and see what the ranges are and think about them as careers for themselves, actually. Exactly. So that's the kind of wage. We always talk about the wage gap, but there's also an opportunity gap. And that's part of people having that information. So, well, I have a lot of questions to dig in there, but I think we'll bring some more people into this conversation and then go back to some of them. So Seher, and as I mentioned, Seher is just one of the amazing advocates who really helped forward and promote this bill. She's a senior attorney at Legal Momentum. It's been hard work together on this, Seher. So Christine talked about, let's say, the business perspective, but what about the worker perspective? Why is this law so critical in what we're talking about in terms of closing the wage and opportunity gap for workers, especially, I would say, low-wage workers and women and people of color? Why do you see this as such a game changer, as we call it?
Well, Bev, before I jump into your question, I just want to acknowledge, former council member Helen Rosenthal for introducing this legislation and being such an ardent advocate for it, because it really is such an important law for workers. And I also want to acknowledge you, Bev, and PowHer New York for your leadership on pay equity in the state. I do not think we would be where we are with respect to pay equity in the state without you bringing so many of us to the table to take action on this. Now, to turn to your question, I think there are a number of ways that the city's pay transparency law and similar bills will really help workers and will help us tackle broader inequities, including racial and gender-based pay disparities. I think as a starting point, it's important to note that we know pay transparency works because across the board, we've seen smaller gender pay gaps in sectors and jurisdictions where greater transparency exists. We see this in the public sector, in unionized jobs, and in other countries where pay scales are already public. But this is more of an outcome rather than a rationale. And I think the bigger question is, why does pay transparency work? In a snapshot, it works because it forces employers to be better, it gives workers more power, and it forces us as a society to address broader inequities. And I'm going to elaborate a bit on each of these. Starting with employers, I think one of the most important benefits of this type of pay transparency requirement is that it forces employers to do something we have long been asking them to do, which is simply to review and assess how they are setting pay and be more thoughtful and deliberate and equitable in their approach. I think for too long, employers have set salary on a case-by-case basis, looking at individual candidates, which really results in this kind of piecemeal and incoherent approach that allows for unconscious biases to creep in. And that whole methodology is likely inequitable. It's likely hard to rationalize or explain. I think, as Christine was mentioning, part of this is going to be a big lift for employers, largely because they now have to do what they really should have been doing from the very beginning. I think because pay scales are for new positions will now be public, employers have to worry about that public perception and what their existing employees are going to be thinking once those salary ranges are public. They're going to have to develop a more objective methodology for setting pay going forward and hopefully address some of those disparities. Not all employers are going to go this route. I think the smart ones will. And we know many are thinking along these lines because this was one of the grounds for delaying implementation of the law so that more employers had time to really clean house and get their pay scales in order. I think for workers more directly, who have been completely in the dark, unless you're really in a position of power or have this information. This law is really a game changer, as you said, Bev, in multiple respects. First, it gives workers a better idea of what different employers are paying, allowing you to seek out higher paying employers and jobs. Second, as we mentioned, it gives you a better idea of what different jobs are worth. And that really empowers workers to seek work in higher paying industries. And in a way is a starting point in empowering workers to combat occupational segregation, which we know is this trend of pushing women and people of color into lower wage industries. I think for existing employees, it gives you some measurement of whether or not you're being paid fairly. And lastly, it gives workers more leverage during salary negotiations, so they aren't just shooting in the dark or short selling themselves. And this is particularly important for women and people of color who, due to long-term discrimination, have long been offered and paid less, and who carry that with them with each subsequent job they seek. I think here I also just want to highlight that as we advocated for these laws, we came across this misperception that this type of legislation was only really meant to help higher earners by revealing those apples to apple disparities. And I think it's really important to know that this type of legislation is equally meant to protect low wage workers. We advocated very hard to make sure it would do that. By allowing employers to set wages in the dark, we've made it easier for them to set low, often exploitative wages. And I think the hope is that by forcing employers to disclose this information upfront and in public, it really encourages employers to shift away from these practices. It creates more formality around wage rates in these lower wage industries. And it, like I said, empowers workers to better identify better employers. And lastly, I'll just mention, I think for society more broadly, I think it's worth recognizing that it's going to force us to confront our demons a little bit. This is the first step. This first step towards transparency is going to start giving us a clearer picture about how we as a society value different types of jobs. It's going to start to reveal some of those gross inequities that when looking at the lowest to highest paying jobs within a given company or sector or cross sectors. And, the degree to which women and people of color are segregated in those lower paid jobs. None of this is new. This has long been something we are aware of, but I think now we're going to see a lot more numbers attached to it. And I think that's going to help us pinpoint some of the worst offenders and hopefully create some accountability and more urgency to address the issue.
Mhm. There's so many things to unpack there, Seher. I have been talking to different people about this law, and I have to say, everyone on the worker side has been very excited about it, particularly young workers. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to talk to young workers, but if it seems like this is the world that they live in, where is transparency, but also it's going to help them at the beginning of their career. So it's very exciting for all workers. But I've just gotten incredible enthusiasm from young workers, because they're entering the job market in the dark, basically, right? So that's just I'm going to be able to know the salary range before I go in or even apply. They just think it's like, of course I should know that, but now I'll have that information. So it's pretty exciting. Lots of other points that we can get into in a moment, but I want to bring Jackie Ebanks into this conversation now. So Jackie, you're the head of the Commission on Gender Equity for all of New York City. And I've had the pleasure to work with you over the years. And I know your commitment to gender and racial equity, as well as the cities. So I guess my question for you is, how does a bill like this, or this bill actually, how does this bring New York City closer to this goal that is set for economic equity? And on a broader question, how is this part of, let's say, a historic fight to end systemic racism and sexism that so many of us are concerned with or working toward? So what are your perspectives on that, Jackie?
Thank you so much, Bev, for this opportunity. And it's a pleasure to share this discussion with my colleagues, Christine, Seher, and JoAnn. I really want to celebrate your leadership as well, not only as founder and president of PowHer New York, but as a member of the Commission on Gender Equity. And simultaneously, Seher is a new member for the Commission on Gender Equity, and you all both have been leaders. And I want to really celebrate some of our members who are also on this call, Miriam Clark and Rabina Niaz. We get here because of collaboration, We get here because there is a partnership which is cross-sector in nature. That tends not to be known, but Christine and many other players in the for-profit space have been partners with nonprofit advocates, with public officials and appointees like JoAnn and myself to create this equitable city. And that, for me, when I think about this law, is the overarching goal. This law is about empowering workers, job seekers, as Seher said, regardless of age. I think, Christine, that narrative of your father-in-law is a really powerful one. So it's, from youth to older, it's from low-income wage to high-income earners. The value of transparency also gives us autonomy to shape our careers and to some degree further influence our economic strength and our economic vitality. And I think the Commission on Gender Equity sees this as a clear goal. We want to fashion economic mobility and opportunity in New York City, a city where every individual, regardless of gender identity or gender expression and background, should have the opportunity to thrive economically. This is just one part of the journey, though. JoAnn, in her remarks, and you, Bev, talked about the other laws that have come before this and really form a foundation for our work. So we need to see the salary transparency law in connection and working in concert with these other laws, which strengthens the hand of the worker for self-determination, further driving their own economic vitality and viability. And I think that's really critical. It is a part of this historic lens of combating racial and gender injustice. And I think the thing we've learned over the past several years is that this journey to justice is not linear, that there are victories and there are losses, and sometimes they happen simultaneously, and you don't know if you're going forward or backwards. But today we can really celebrate this as a significant movement forward. But I dare say that the key piece for us is this issue of accountability and working on both sides in the public sector and in the for-profit sector to really partner on behalf of workers and to ensure that we can create the workplace that gives workers the best possible outcome so that they can live their strongest and fullest lives in New York City. I think that's where the Commission on Gender Equity stands. And as the Adams administration looks on this work, we're looking at it from this equity lens and being steadfast to ensuring that all New Yorkers, again, regardless of gender identity, gender expression, or background, have this opportunity to thrive. And I just want to point out one of the things we haven't talked about yet is that the outcome for New Yorkers is different based on different intersectionalities. And so we know the challenge of, when gender is coupled with age, or is coupled with race, or tripled with race, you get very different outcomes. And I think there's been a lot of data on sort of what Black women earn versus what Asian women earn. And we know at the end of November, I think Native American women will have their equal pay day. That is a full 11 months post a 12-month period of a white male. And so I think as we make these laws and as we implement them and as we celebrate the victories, we have to remember that we've not yet arrived, and that this goal for an equitable New York City and hopefully an equitable globe is one that requires all of us to continue to partner and to be disciplined and diligent on behalf of the least of us, dare I say that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jackie. And, putting that in perspective, that's where the advocates start, is like, what can we do about the inequities that we see? And then step by step, we find ways, to change policies or practices. I think the really important part here is, the business community, right? So we want the business community to be a partner in this change, and they need to be a partner in this change. But sometimes companies, some companies are already embracing this, and others are perhaps going to make it more difficult to have salary ranges, that really do reflect the job. So I've gotten a question about, what do you do when there's a huge salary range that's posted, or no salary range that's posted? There's two different issues there, right? So I guess, JoAnn, what does someone do when they, as a member of the public, or even as a job seeker, that's part of the making this work, right? Piece of it. So I don't know if you can just advise people what to do when they see either one of the problems, actually.
Sure. And it's, despite the lighting in my office, it's not turned to midnight here. It is lunchtime, just like for everybody else. But I need to work on my tech. This is a great question. And I think just before answering specifically how the commission is here for New Yorkers, I want to just build on something Jackie was saying, which is obviously this is a law. I am a lawyer. I believe that law plays a very important role in social change, but this is really, I think, to some of the points Christine and Jackie and all of the speakers were making, this is about shifting a culture and what it's like to talk about money and who feels comfortable asking questions about money. And so I think it's going to be a useful tool. The law will be in encouraging positive behavior. There's always people who don't want to comply with the law, but I think it's also useful for us to think about, as we've discussed, like people are already doing this before the law. And so how do we build on that? And I think continue to identify, as everyone has been doing, the benefits across sectors and what that means for economic vitality for our city, but all the places that have this law as well. So of course, people should contact the Commission on Human Rights if you see a job posting that has no salary included, or something that maybe doesn't seem to be in good faith, one of lawyers' good nebulous standards, good faith. But we can be reached in lots of ways. People can come to our office, and we actually have an office in each of the 5 boroughs. We have an online complaint form where people can submit things they've seen. And we have a phone number, which I think is on the website that was just put in the chat, 212-416-0197. And when you contact us, you either speak with someone in our intake team or an attorney who will talk through with you potential violations of our law. So I should say that people can, if they think their human rights are violated, there's sort of 2 main places you can go. Us, the Commission, and we can file a complaint. People can file a complaint with us whether or not they have an attorney, and people can also typically bring a cause of action in court saying that the human rights law was violated. So the salary transparency, pay transparency provisions have a little bit of a different approach built into the law. And what the law says is upon first violation, so say we get, someone comes to us and they say, this employer posted a job, it has no salary. Instead of thinking about what penalties might exist in that scenario, we will actually reach out to employers and they will have 30 days to correct the violation. So this goes to some of the pieces that we've been talking about and some of the ways that the law was created to try and, again, keep the spirit and intent in line, but also think about the realities of what it means for some businesses, right? Businesses are all over the spectrum in terms of their HR staffing and know-how. And I think that that is built into this law. And the other thing I will say, while mostly you can bring causes of action to court under the human rights law, for this law, only current employees can actually file in court. So everyone else would come to the Commission if they thought that this provision of the law or any of the others that I mentioned were violated.
Thank you for that. That is one piece of the law that I think advocates want it to be broader. And there are some other pieces as well. So Seher, I'm going to turn to you.
Could I weigh in really quickly?
Please do that. Yes. Okay. Feel free, everyone, to jump in.
Okay, perfect. The other thing to just note is that the job postings will take a little bit of time to get updated and be accurate, so that jobs are posted not just for a day, but often for weeks and sometimes even a longer period of time. So if someone posted a job a month ago, it may not include that the pay information. It doesn't mean that they were outside of compliance of the law necessarily, but it was just posted before the law went into effect. You could, of course, reach out, but you may, if the job process happens quickly. So definitely also reach out to the employer, like ask the recruiter, what is the range? What is the range for that role? I noticed it didn't have it, and allow, assume some good intent and just understand that it's going to take a little bit of time just operationally to get all of that information up there. So you may be faster actually to also ask the employer to the extent that you feel comfortable with doing that.
Right. That's a really good point, Christine. And also, if anyone wants to hop in, please do. But when we were working on this law, we always said it's not intended as we gotcha. It's really intended to change practice and culture, and that takes time, right? So I really appreciate, you're pointing that out. And I think that's one of the reasons that there is no penalty for first violation, because the writers understood that this is going to take time. But I was gonna, Seher, what's missing from this bill? And then I'd like to just talk about what do you all think might be next in this, effort, in this campaign, ongoing journey toward pay equity in New York? Ms. Seher?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bev. So I want to approach your question less from the perspective of what as an advocacy community we are going to be pushing for next, although, it is a teaser, but rather what employers who legitimately care about equity should be thinking about and proactively doing as they make this shift, because it's the right thing to do. It's a smart thing to do. And because it's coming sooner or later, as Christine mentioned. So I think the first thing we encourage as a best practice is broader disclosure of compensation and benefits. A lot of employers are already doing this. And I think, JoAnn made clear that the current law only requires disclosure of base salary, yet depending on your industry, we know that inequity is often introduced through other forms of compensation and benefits. This may be through bonuses and stock options, or through benefits like healthcare or paid family leave, which have a huge impact on women and have had a huge impact during the pandemic. Second, and this is, a spoiler alert for the New York State bill, we encourage employers to disclose job descriptions. It's essential that workers know what job responsibilities are attached to the salary range so that employers can't deflate that wage after the fact by expanding the job responsibilities. Third, employers should be moving towards disclosing current salary ranges to existing employees upon their request and at regular intervals. A few of the bills and laws that we're seeing in other states, and this was something we tried to push in the New York State bill but didn't get to, is this disclosure to existing employees, which is really, really important. And I think, for smaller employees, including those that are not covered, it's really, I think, a good idea to aim to get on board with this practice. I think research is increasingly showing that employers who don't disclose salary information, and Christine cited to some of that, are at a competitive disadvantage. And then I think the current definition of salary range as good faith range said at the time of posting is, at the time when we came in, there was no definition for the salary range, and that's all we could get. We don't think it's ideal. It is a little ambiguous, as JoAnn pointed to. I think we're going to be looking to that and seeing how employers respond. And we really encourage employers to set accurate ranges and to comply in good faith so that we don't have to narrow this language further in the future. And I think, to the discussion we were having earlier, for those employers who are posting a very broad ranges to kind of skirt the law, I think it's worth recognizing that it's a red flag. It's a red flag in terms of compliance with the law. It's a red flag for applicants who are looking at the fact that you're willing to pay such a broad range and for what, and I think it's a red flag for existing employees who should be taking a look at these ranges and wondering, why is my employer setting such an absurd range for a job I'm doing? And so that's something people should be paying attention to. And lastly, in Colorado, we saw employers post jobs carving out Colorado workers. And again, I would discourage this practice I think in Colorado, it's considered a violation of the statute. And most importantly, it just was not a good look.
No. And the employers that were saying, Colorado folks can't apply, now that got some attention, but now really employers are complying with the law and they are, offering their jobs across the United States. So these things do work themselves out because they're serious laws that have to be, addressed. So
in Colorado, Bev, like I think one of the problems that the New York City law really corrected against was they were putting out guidance on within a month of the law going into effect. So there wasn't even employer guidance, that it didn't go out until November, with a law going into effect on January 1st, a law that had never existed anywhere in the US. It was an enormous amount of change management.
Right.
So a lot of employers, I think, took that not in Colorado, not because they were trying to skirt the law, but honestly, because they just couldn't get it operationalized quick enough with a month lag time. You know, if you've got an organization that's large, steering a ship like that, it doesn't just turn on a dime. So I think that the additional time that the New York City gave for compliance really does help in that regard, because it helps employers do the right thing, that are, you know, I think by and large committed to wanting to do the right thing.
It's so great to have you on the panel to really give us insight into what's going on in the business community, you know, because either we have government or, you know, the not-for-profit, you know, this is the perfect connection so that we can forward these kinds of laws in a very positive way. As you point out, these issues, you know, these things that are realities in the business community. So I really appreciate that. We're going to be out of time shortly, and I've put in some of the questions that you have. If anyone has other questions from the audience, you should put them in now, and we'll get answers for you. But I do want to give everyone a chance to say something as an end. However, I would like to just bring up one more point of looking forward, and that is the use of data to figure out, you know, companies have to use the data to figure out, am I paying people fairly? But there is a trend of using data. So maybe, Christine, you could talk about that briefly. And I don't know if you want to mention, Jackie, the local law 18, because I think the two, you can go first as well. If
Sure.
you want to.
You go first.
Yeah.
You know, I'm glad you raised this, because I wanted to talk about the changing culture is a multifaceted job, right? That you do need law. You need cross-sector collaboration, you need research, and you need these activities like what you're engaged in here, Bev, public education and engagement. And so that all of those four things have to work together simultaneously at different paces, certainly, to ensure that we change culture. And so the goal is not just achieving pay equity, but maintaining it, right? So this longer term stretch, so that we don't have this cycling in and out. And so New York City has local law 18. I think it started first in 2019, and it's improving over time, where the City Council requires our Office of Data Analytics to do reporting on gender and racial pay scales for various job titles in New York City government. And that gives us a handle on the nature, the complexity of the pay gap, and then for us to begin leveraging this data appropriately to try to determine a sustainable change to the gap, right? It's not this one-off, it's not sort of this, and I think this is sometimes a narrative we have to guard against. There's no $1 amount that's going to rectify this. It's such a complex space. And I think we have to be very mindful of what that is. And Bev, the commission in 2018 released Leveling the Paying Field report, which talked about the pay equity as compensation plus these other culture shifts. You have to look at representation, you have to look at retention, you have to look at recruitment strategies, you have to look at benefits around pregnancy and care, and caregiving. And so I think to recognize this is a really complex issue with multiple moving parts impacted by various events. Let's talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the huge shift that created. And we always have to be mindful that there needs to be a nimbleness, there needs to be an intentionality at this work, and there needs to be partnership and center the workers. Center the workers, and we'll be better off as we drive for equity.
Thank you for bringing up that local law, you know, and it's really extraordinary. And I do want to acknowledge that one of our main partners in this work has been CWA Local 1180, and they did promote and have worked on, you know, this data reporting for the city and workforce. As well, just a shout out to Miriam Clark of NELA, New York, for their intense work on this as well. A lot of people are involved, but you see the folks here as well as NELA New York and CWA. We want to just acknowledge just how important their participation was in making this happen. Christine, a quick comment about this move toward data reporting.
Yeah, I think that's where we're headed. I think that sharing salary data is really only a partial solution to employee demands for workplace equity. We tell our clients all of the time that pay transparency is table stakes for a much larger and more critical conversation about opportunity equity. So we need to be focused not just on equal pay for equal work, but also the broader conversation of equal access to opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where, if we look out 3-5 years from now, not only do I think that we're going to have, it's going to become standard that the pay ranges are on all of our job postings, but I think that you're going to see employers posting their median pay gap, assessing their median pay gap, because that's a full body scan, not just of, are we paying people the same for the same job, but do we have BIPOC leaders in equal numbers in senior level roles, in more highly paid roles, that we have their white peers, and the same thing for women. So I think that is, I think, where the direction of the law is going, both with California's SB 1162, just signed by Governor Newsom, the New York State contractor pay bill that, of course, is sitting on the governor's desk as 2239, but also employers like Microsoft, Visa, Disney, Apple, Starbucks, and many more beginning to disclose their median pay gap. And I think that that's going to become like what the next, where the world is headed. So, I think that that's going to be an interesting conversation. I agree with you totally, Jackie, on that.
Unless JoAnn or Seher, you want to add something, I'm going to wrap up. JoAnn, you're good. Okay, Seher. I want to thank this panel, for coming together today on the day that the law goes into effect. We're very excited about this, of course. And this is really not the culmination. It's just a really high point in effort that I know I was involved in from 2007. So for all of you out there who think, oh, things don't change, they do change. It may take a long time. And these are really important and big shifts that we're making. Racism and sexism is so deeply rooted in our DNA that it takes time and a lot of advocacy and effort to shift that. And we are doing it here in New York. We do it in collaboration with the folks you see here, as well as so many of the partners for PowHer and advocates who, call and email and hold conversations, with their neighbors and with their legislators. So I think everyone has a space here to advance this work. We are just celebrating a big, big win for New York City. We want this for all of New York State. So Governor Hochul, we encourage you to sign that bill, and the one that you just mentioned, Christine, which is the contractor reporting of equal pay. And stay tuned for many more exciting efforts that PowHer will help coordinate in the future. But thank you everyone for being here today, for celebrating together, and also now for working together to continue this fight for gender, racial equity in New York. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.